Welcome to the Time Management Podcast with me, your host, Abigail Barnes. I'm a productivity coach, global speaker, time management author, and award-winning entrepreneur on a mission to share the 888 formula with the world and to remind you that it's your time. Leave it to me to bring you new time management tips, tricks, tools, and strategies, to introduce you to guests, research, and case studies from around the world, and to give you a simple 5-step process you can follow to uplevel your productivity, achieve your goals, and create a life that exceeds your wildest dreams. I'm so excited that you're here, so let's get started. Welcome to the show. I am so excited today to be joined by the amazing Daryn Wober. Welcome to the show, Daryn.
Thanks, Abigail. It's great to be here today with you.
Who is Daryn Wober in a nutshell?
First and foremost, I'm just a being that's trying to find my way in the world. In addition to that, the things that we may commonly associate with that is that I'm a father of a young daughter. I'm a husband. More recently in my life, I'm now a yoga teacher and a yoga therapist. And I work with a range of different people, both in groups and individuals, to help them with physical conditions, with situations or stresses or challenges they may have in their lives, and just really trying to help people to learn and imbibe the spirit of yoga and what it can offer them in terms of healing and the ability to change and transform their lives.
What has led you to what it is that you do today? And perhaps let's start by talking about your relationship with time back in the day.
Back in the day, for me, I used to run a digital marketing agency. And actually before that, for a good 20 years, I was working in the corporate world. And at that time, in that world, it's fair to say that time was my ruler and my master, in the sense that I was so attached to the idea of needing to fill time and to get things done and be productive. My relationship with time was one that caused me a lot of stress. I never felt there was enough time in the day. And because of that, I would work very, very late and also get up very, very early if I even managed to sleep at all, because of the amount of stress that was present in my life back then. And there was just generally a feeling that everything had to be done now and everything had to be pushed and everything needed to be really physically done. I often talked about the idea of trying to push water uphill. It's a never-ending task. That was definitely the way that I related to time and the way that time came into my life in a way that caused a lot of stress and a lot of challenges for me that I didn't really recognize that at the time.
What was the wake-up call that's led you to the path that you're on now? It's almost like two sides of the same coin.
It's an interesting question because it brings in the idea of where does a narrative start? And so the long view of this is, well, actually the journey started when I was born, and we could even say perhaps even before that. Or we could say that there was a specific point along the way. For the purposes of this conversation, I can pretty much say that all of the stress and all of the challenges of running a business, and I was also living in Nigeria at the time, led me to a point where I just felt completely psychologically and emotionally exhausted. And I also at the same time, not coincidentally, got a terrible, terrible back problem in my lower back. I was debilitated. In seeking to heal my back, I was advised that taking up this thing called yoga, which in the past, yoga to me was something that I laughed at, if I'm completely honest. It was just funny people doing funny things with their body that just didn't look very difficult or challenging or in any way enlightening. So when I heard this, I thought, okay, if it can help my back, I'll give it a go. And that started my journey, which was originally just me doing some stretches in the gym after I finished doing all of my crazy weightlifting and running and pounding my body and all that kind of stuff. Then gradually it transitioned into me attending a wonderful teacher's class in Nigeria, my first teacher. Originally going once a week, then finding myself there twice a week, then finding myself there 3 times a week, and then going to all of her classes and just suddenly hearing things in those classes that I just needed to hear. And gradually over time, my back started to feel a lot better. And I decided actually not just practicing in the studio was something I wanted to do, but I started to actually practice on my own. So I'd come home and I'd scribble down in stickmen what we practiced in the class, and then I'd start to practice that at home. And gradually over time, started to notice and feel a shift in my energy, a shift in the way that I was feeling, which then led to what felt like for me some significant moments of realization around what was causing my problems in my life and perhaps a pathway to resolving those challenges over time.
And were you still working in your corporate job at this time?
I was very much working in my corporate corporate job at that time. What started to happen was that I started to be a little bit late in the morning because after a class, particularly in Nigeria, you are drenched in sweat because it's so hot. So I'd have to go and have a shower, get ready, and then go to work. And then people often noticed that I was starting to clock off a little bit early because commuting in Nigeria and Lagos was pretty difficult to get to the class at 7 o'clock. And that was always moving through the traffic to get there on time. So I was still working. What happened was around, I guess, a year and a half into me practicing. To cut a longish story short, I just happened to wake up one day, having been practicing on a daily basis for probably a few months at that point. And I just felt like the weight of the world had been lifted off my shoulders. It was an almost indescribable feeling, just of lightness and of a feeling that somehow something heavy, something claustrophobic and pressing had just suddenly just melted away. And I really didn't know what was going on. It was very strange. It was very pleasant. And I just kind of walked around with a kind of childish smile on face for quite a while. I was just suddenly really interested in looking at the sky and looking at flowers and trees. And I continued working at this point, but everything just became a little bit lighter. I would say that's when my relationship with time really started to change and to transform. And it was probably at that time I began to realize that I could work in what I was doing, but that actually my relationship to that work could be very different. Although within a few months that changed again.
I'm loving this. It sounds to me really is you went on a spiritual awakening journey, but you were quite probably, as most of us are, unaware that you were on a spiritual awakening journey. You just had back pain, you were overworked, you found something, you started to feel better. Talk a little bit more into that for the person who is in the middle of their, I don't know what to do next. Was it guidance? Was it intuition? What was leading you in those early days out of this place of unwell?
From the moment I started to practice yoga, there was just a feeling inside that this is what I was meant to be doing. This was just where I was supposed to be, that my body needed it, that my mind needed it, that my breath needed it, that everything that was defined as me needed this tonic or this balm or this medicine. And so that just became a very kind of compelling reason for me to kind of continue doing it. So it really didn't feel like there was any great effort at all. There was just something, as you said, very intuitive about it that just said, yeah, this is what I need to be doing. And that leads me into the second point, which is that there kind of comes a point in our lives where if we look back at our patterns, and yoga talks a lot about what patterns are and where they sit within the kind of psychological dimension and so on. If we look at our patterns, what we notice is that our patterns continue to repeat themselves. And they repeat themselves because our actions continue to repeat themselves. So an action done in the same way, with the same attitude, in the same manner, causes the same outcome. It might be a different person in front of you, it might be a different job in front of you, whatever it is, but that pattern will find its way. So the reason I mention that is because yoga talks about the fact that all you need to do is just slightly change one of your habits or one of your patterns or one of your actions, and it will take you to a new place. And to be honest with you, having banged my head against the corporate wall for 20 years or so, and also, if I'm being a bit more personal and sort of honest in this sense, having banged my head against the wall of relationships for 20 years, I realized that I was always ending up in the same place. So something inside me said, if you want your life to change, not in necessarily an aspirational way, but just in a way simply as, how can I feel more comfortable in my own skin? And how can I feel more peaceful as a human being in life? I need to do something different. And yoga just presented itself to me as this thing that was different. And I gradually just began to notice that by doing all of this stuff on the mat, the effects didn't remain on the mat. The effects actually jumped off the mat into real life. Not that the mat is not real life, but into day-to-day, the sparring and activity of day-to-day life. And I started to notice, having also been in psychotherapy at various points, that actually psychotherapy helps you, for me personally, let me just say that, to recognize patterns. But for me, it didn't necessarily help me to transcend those patterns. It's not to say that it doesn't for certain people, and I'm just talking about the type of therapy that I have. But actually, yoga, I could start to see, wow, this is actually something that is beginning to change and shift my behavior, my relationship to life, my relationship to time, my relationship to other people. And from that moment on, it was just a gathering of depth of faith in these tools and just wanting to find out more and more and more about this practice.
We've had a previous guest on who was talking about movement as medicine. It's really sounding to me like this is what you discovered on the journey. Talk us through the next step. You're feeling better, your back is getting better, you are becoming consciously aware of subconscious patterns, which, with the benefit of hindsight, is so obvious. But when you're in it, deciding and making a decision and trusting your intuition, what is the next step? Should I try this? Should I try that? Talk us through how you then move from the corporate job to your next step.
Anyone that knew me back in those days, I was going to push 100% to salvage a client, to win a client, to get a new deal. It was just, was the way I was. It was the way I lived. It was the way I thought. It was just how I thought things should be done. And we had one very, very big client, too big actually. We were too dependent on that client. And we got called into a meeting with the owner of this big company in Nigeria. And as the meeting went on, it became very apparent that it was going to be very, very difficult for us to retain the client, which was going to spell quite a big problem for the company. But as the meeting went on, I just found myself thinking, I just don't really know if I care about this anymore. And sorry if you're listening, because it's not that I didn't want to work with you guys, but it was just something very personal. I found myself halfway through the meeting, before they could even say, look, I just found myself saying, yeah, I think we're probably going to step away from it. And I remember walking outside, getting into the car, taking a big breath in and out and thinking, what have you just done? I then had to call my other directors and tell them that basically Daryn, who was supposedly spearheading this company, voluntarily given up our biggest client. They knew why. It wasn't completely out of the blue. There were problems in the relationship. And at that moment, I had two options. There was the old pattern, call a war room. Let's write down every possible client we can have. Let's look at how we can get more revenue out of every existing client. Let's just go for it. And I just found myself realizing I just had no more fuel in the tank. My prime responsibility at that point, after I decided in those next few days that I wanted to close down the company because I just did not have the enthusiasm, the energy, I knew it was never going to fulfill me at a deep level. It was, what do I do with our staff? And as it unfolded over the next couple of weeks, it turned out that the client that we had let go of would willingly take all of the staff. Once that was sorted, I felt like I could sleep easily at night knowing that I'd done what I needed to do. And that was probably in September, and by the end of December, the company had closed out. I get to December, I genuinely have no idea what I'm going to do. No idea whatsoever. I know that I've given up this company that I've built over 6 or 7 years, that it was like my dream and all this kind of thing, and now I just have nothing. But what I did have was more opportunity to practice, what I call couch sitting. So there was something intuitively within that just said, Daryn, you've got nothing to do in terms of work. You're going to sit on the couch and you're going to see if you can be content. And I gradually practiced that. It was a kind of meditation. It was a weird thing. It just came to me, and it may sound a bit bizarre, but it was just, okay, how can I just practice being content in this moment? And then over the next couple of weeks, something just popped up in my mind, and I kept on hearing it. I think it actually may have come from a George Harrison interview from the 70s, Yogis in the Himalayas. Yogis in the Himalayas. I'd heard this from him, I think, and it just suddenly just started playing round and round. And I just thought, I know what I need to do. I'm going to the Himalayas and I'm going to go and learn some yoga. And then I thought, actually, as I looked into it, I'm going to go and do a teacher training because I really want to deepen my practice. I spoke to my wife, my partner at the time, now my wife, and she was like, go for it. Go on, what's stopping you? Get on with it. Book something. Go and do it. With her seal of approval, I booked 200-hour teacher training, the first of various training. And I headed off to the Himalayas in March of that year. So basically less than 3 months after I closed down the business. And by the way, I should just say I had no intention of teaching at that point. This was purely, I want to go to India. There is something about India that I need to go and experience. There's something about deepening my practice that I need to go and do. And the rest will take care of itself. That's how I ended up in India for the first time.
And this was a 200-hour yoga teacher training that was your first step?
It was a 200-hour yoga teacher training. It was chosen very much on intuition. I wouldn't have even known what to research at that point. I didn't know about lineages or traditions or practices or anything like that. It was like, okay, there's yoga. It's in the Himalayas. It looks all right. Here are a couple of reviews. Let's just go and do it.
And the usual thing that would come up here, the monkey mind. What have you done? How are you going to make money? who are you? What was going on there in your head? Had the yoga helped to silence those? Was the real Daryn speaking up?
To say the real Daryn, I think, is something that we can unpack, because that reality is something that I think is difficult to discern. There's the identity on the level where there is a name, and then there is everything that is beyond that. The way I like to think of it is that practice helps you to refine over time, to let go of the things that are obvious errors in terms of how we associate or identify, and to ground more into a space which is actually identity less. But I think what was going on at that point, and this is where I regard myself as quite fortunate, when I had that moment, everything feels okay in the moment, that day that I woke up in Nigeria, a lot of things fell away that day. And one of the things that fell away was this: before that point, what did I go and do on a Saturday afternoon when I lived in London, when I was feeling anxious and depressed and stressed? I'd go to Selfridges and I'd go and spend loads of money on designer clothes, and then I'd make sure I had somewhere to go that evening so I could go and like rock my new blazer or wear my new jeans and sort of feel really kind of cool about myself. But deep down I didn't. All of that melted away, even when I was out in India, and even when I had the moment of realization that actually I want to teach, even though I could hear from the people in my life, are you sure about this? What are you doing? There was just something that felt so certain within me that what I was doing was right for me and what I needed to do in that moment, that I was no longer really even connecting into those patterns. It's fair to say that as years have passed, those patterns and thought processes have actually come up, particularly now I'm living back in London, particularly now I'm a father, particularly now I have responsibility. And that's worth admitting, not just admitting, but actually surfacing. This is a lifelong journey, and it's not just you have one moment of, oh, I'm suddenly like feeling like this. That's just one layer of the onion shedding, and there's still plenty of layers waiting for all of that. Letting go in that moment created the space for me to dive really fully and completely into the practice and into the exploration and the seeking, you might say, and give me my time with it, so that stuff just wasn't really present. So I was practicing every day. It's worth mentioning that. But beyond that, I wasn't really having to battle with the thoughts.
This is such a huge conversation. We're definitely going to have you back. But the benefit of this conversation, the early steps, the client who is coming to you, who is having their dark night of the soul, which incidentally isn't a night, it's a lifetime, but who is awakening to, why am I here? I'm in pain. I don't feel good. I'm overwhelmed. Let's just talk about that process of how you guide them on the journey.
The first thing to say is that, as you know, everyone is different. We all have our own patterns. We all have our own physiological balance or imbalances. We all have our own psychological balances and imbalances. So we are completely unique. And therefore, in terms of the approach of yoga that I've learned, which is from a tradition that is associated with a great yogi called Sri T Krishnamacharya, who I should certainly mention at least, the whole approach is, how can we take all of the tools of yoga and boil them down into an appropriate recipe? I often call this a garam masala mix. In India, garam masala, based on the city that you come from, has a slightly different inflection based on where you are. So yes, the structure and tools of yoga are there in the background, but how do you pick the things off the shelf that are relevant for that person in front of you at that time and meet them where they are? And then from that place, how do you guide them on the journey? As a yoga therapist, what we're trained to do is we're trained to really be present in front of the person and try to identify across various domains, which might be the physical domain. For example, you can tell so much about someone's mind in relation to how you see them move. You can tell so much about someone from the way that you observe them breathing, the way that they gesticulate, the way that their voice sounds. There are so many things, and through spending a little bit of time with the person in question and also listening to their case history, you begin to understand where the imbalances lie within their system. And then once you have an understanding of those imbalances, you can begin to put together some practices or some recommendations, which might be movement practices or breath practices or meditation practices or chanting practices or visualization practices, as well as, because this is where it's important, what habits need to change off the mat. For example, is there an imbalance in diet? Is there an issue with sleep? Is there an imbalance in terms of what's called the vritti, or the occupation of the person and the way that they're relating to their work? It's a full domain. It's a full spectrum where you look holistically, which is why we call yoga holistic, at everything. And you gradually, over time, hopefully without overwhelming the person in front of you, you gradually decide, okay, what's the priority? Where do we start? And often what will happen is that the person will end up with a little sheet, and on that sheet I'll have scribbled some stick people and some notes, and that's their practice. And the thing I should mention that's really important about this particular way of work is that the role of the student or the person being cared for or the client is to empower themselves to heal. I'm not a healer. All I can do is offer practices that I think are appropriate, that the other person has to take up and bring into their lives. And that's one of the biggest differences between these ancient systems and modern systems of medicine. We've come into a society now where basically we are the patient, so we have to be patient, and we're just given things and we're passive and we take them and they either work or they don't. There's a lot of cases that they do work. The difference here is that we are empowered to say, okay, if you want to heal at the deepest level, we've got to do the work. And I always say that that's the good news of yoga and it's the bad news. The bad news because it means you've got to do something. I try to encourage people, and actually where a lot of the work is trying to overcome the inertia that is present when we try to start practicing on a regular basis. And then gradually what happens is the thing just unfolds over time. It becomes very obvious. Once people start practicing and they start to get insights from their practice, that dialogue between us starts to lead us forward.
As a yoga therapist, what kinds of clients are coming to you and how does your work help them?
Well, it tends to be quite a mixture. I get a few people who come with purely physiological problems. And I say that, I repeated the purely, because, for example, funnily enough, at the moment, a lot of people are coming with neck complaints and shoulder complaints. When you look into this, you realize actually that stress affects the way that we breathe. And when we breathe, for example, in a top-heavy manner from the chest, it can place a lot of undue stress on the apparatus at the top of the body, so in the shoulders and the neck, the scalene muscles and everything. That can easily then transmit into a long-term neck problem that's built up as an imbalance over time. So there's always a psychological component, and therefore underneath that a spiritual component to anyone's healing journey, even if it's just something as simple as shoulder. So there's a few kind of physiological issues. There's also a lot of autoimmune disorders that I'm working with. Then generally what are called lifestyle diseases and things that are very, very prevalent these days. So things like diabetes, metabolic disorders, high blood pressure, asthma, and various things like that, which yoga can really, really help with. And then finally, and I think where the majority of people who I see come to me is more from the psychological standpoint, anxiety, stress, feeling low, and then kind of going a bit deeper, kind of a general, what am I doing? What's my purpose? Yoga can really help with all of these things. I mean, it's genuinely still mind-blowing to me that there can be a system of practice that is so broad. And remember, as I said before, yoga is not just the postures, and that's why I said I gave that list before. And I'm talking about yoga here, I'm talking about it in its fullest, including the philosophy, which is so helpful. And actually what I should say is that at the beginning of me starting my yoga path and journey, I was reading every yoga philosophy book I could get my hand on, because I just knew that in there were the nuggets of wisdom that can help. So a combination of movement and breath and philosophy and so on, and practicing on a regular basis genuinely begins to shift people's sense of identity, sense of wellness, sense of being. And I've seen it time and time again. Once people actually commit to practicing on a regular basis, and that's the key. If they do that, then my work is done. Yoga takes over, the practice takes over, they're empowered, and it just guides them to where they need to be, not necessarily where they want to be as quickly as they want to get there. And it's not pain-free. And when I say pain-free, I mean there are ups and downs, and we often get to see and experience things inside ourselves. It can be very, very difficult, and that also requires resilience to stay on the path, and people tend to drop away at that point as well. They also tend to drop away at a point where they suddenly realize that there are things in their lives that they really no longer appreciate, and it gets a bit too intense, and then they just want to just leave it and not have to deal with it, which I understand. Maybe it wasn't their time. So all sorts of things come up when people start to walk the path of practice. You can immediately see the difference a little bit.
Let's deep dive a little bit more into yoga, and perhaps you could tell us about where the physical practice sits within the 8 limbs of yoga.
Sure. It's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it. I actually think the thing that I'd like to focus on, because I know we've got a limited amount of time, is, as you said, in the Ashtanga yoga system, means the 8 limbs of yoga. Asana, which means the movement, is the 3rd limb. So the question becomes, well, if it's the 3rd limb, and we're gradually evolving from 1 to 8, and these things are complementing us as we move, what's 1 and 2? Because it's rare that if you were to put out a survey or a poll, like what's 1 and 2, apart from teachers and maybe people who are particularly committed to the path that anyone would know? And the answer is what are called the yamas and the niyamas. Basically, to cut a very, very long story short, the yamas and the niyamas, attitudes that we hold towards ourselves, and then also the way that we relate externally into the world. So probably the most famous of the yamas is ahimsa, which means the practice of non-violence, followed closely by satya, which means truth. And if you read or learn anything about Gandhi, he was massively committed to these practices of truth and to the practice of non-violence. And non-violence not just to people around us, and not just physical non-violence, but emotional non-violence, psychological non-violence, and being kind to ourselves, which even involves how do we treat our body. And as you know from the kind of practices that I teach, I don't practice or teach things that are intense, because again, that could be construed as a form of violence against the body. And that's probably something for another time. But the point I'd just like to make about the yamas and the niyamas is many great teachers, and particularly Krishnamacharya, always used to say that no matter how much you practice asana, no matter how much you practice movement, no matter how much you practice breathwork, or what is traditionally called pranayama, or any of these practices, if you are not standing with one leg and one foot firmly planted in the yama, and one foot and one leg firmly planted in the niyama, your practice will not bear fruit. The example I always give, to be extreme to make the point, is imagine that you're all there in class with your hands together and you're chanting and breathing and doing whatever it is we do, and then you finish your class and you go outside and then someone cuts in front of you, and before you know it, you're screaming and shouting. And we all do that in different ways, myself included. That's going to disturb the mind to the point that it's very difficult to get peaceful. So we have to bring these practices of just let's focus on these two, of non-violence and truth. But truthfulness, as long as it doesn't harm the other person, is also the caveat. We have to bring these things into our lives in a meaningful way, because this is what really starts to transform the mind. The movement absolutely helps us, and the movement is a key part of learning how to be embodied, to get to know our home and to become peaceful with our home, and to let our home become peaceful in and of itself. But these two limbs are super important. Then the asana practice can flourish. Then we set the scene for the garden to really grow and bring us the fruit that we're looking for, which is an arrival in a place of peace and serenity. Not necessarily happiness, because happiness is not something that can be maintained all the time, but just a sense of peace, a sense of, okay, this is all right, I can do this.
What I'm personally finding mind-blowing as I'm listening to you, as I always do whenever I listen to you, Daryn, the way the world has gone over the last couple of decades, and how yoga has become another exercise, another form of exercise that we do to look a certain way so that we can eat what we want and be who we want and achieve what we want. But what I'm actually really hearing you say is, yes, yoga can help with these things. Yes, yoga can improve your mental health. Yes, breath work can help you calm your nervous system. Yes, it can help you sleep better. Yes, 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 tick, tick, tick. But it's so much deeper than that as well. And I guess it can be one, the other. It can be the journey you didn't realize you were going on, and yet you are on it. They say when you start a business, it's the personal development journey you didn't realize you were signing up for. All your shadows come out. And I want to come back to something you said earlier about how perhaps you didn't have the monkey mindset in the early days, but the monkey mindset comes back around again. And I feel like this conversation that we're having today is really exposing we all have a subconscious, and that through the actions that we take, the life experience that we have, what we need to heal next comes up. And as humans, we're trained to look for the medicine to fix it, to feel better, because all I want to do is feel better. But what I'm hearing you really say is that when you can make peace and enjoy the process and use yoga as almost a way of living. What are your thoughts around yoga as a form of exercise, yoga as a way of life, and how to live in this world which is rapidly changing? It's an online world, it's an offline world.
I think I'll just talk for a moment about the exercise part, because I think it's important. Yoga brings asana, let me say asana, movement in a yogic sense, brings a lot of benefits to the physical body. One of the challenges that we have today is that we think and believe that we are time poor. And in many ways, the culture and society has meant that we have become time poor, because there are just so many things that we think we need to do and so many duties we need to fulfill and so on and so forth. And what that's meant is that when we think of yoga in the modern context, we're thinking of two things. We're thinking, I know that yoga actually can help me to get a bit peaceful, but I can also get my 60 minutes of exercise in. And that is the first compromise of the yoga system. Because you've got to remember that back in the day, and when I'm talking back in the day, I'm not talking about 20 years ago, I'm talking about thousands of years, people led much more physical lives, right? They weren't lounging around on nice couches and sleeping in comfortable beds and just getting Ubers to deliver things or take them. If you wanted to go somewhere, you had to take yourself somewhere. If you wanted to eat, you had to go and physically go and get the food and grow it and do whatever it was, or pick it or forage or so on and so forth. And so in that environment, your kind of physical health was very much taken care of just through naturally living. Then the asanas did not need to take the place of having a sedentary lifestyle, which arguably they still shouldn't, right? So unfortunately, because of the time-poor nature that we apparently find ourselves in, it means that we're trying to squeeze multiple, slightly contradictory goals into our yoga practice. Because the thing is that the intensity with which we seek exercise and an intense form of exercise means that if we're doing that in our yoga practice, it is actually solidifying the groove in the mind that creates the need for intensity in the first place. So actually, if we're not careful, that practice can solidify the things that are actually leading us to imbalances in the first place. So I think that's a big, big challenge for the yoga community in general today, particularly because everything is now wrapped in the cloak of commercialization, of course, because people need to make a living. And how do you get people into the studio and so on and so forth? So it's understandable, but I think we have to have our eyes open to it.
What you were saying just there reminds me of a phrase, what we resist persists. To be vulnerable on the podcast, I definitely came at yoga from an exercise point of view a year ago, almost now, since I joined the yoga studio and go every single day, and have noticed as I've done different classes, at the beginning it was all the high intensity classes, and then have found your, let's call them slower classes. Doesn't mean they're easier, they're just slower. And in that slowness, what I was resisting has started to come up. And I've recognized my way of coping was to do a harder, stronger, more intense form of exercise to avoid what I didn't want to look at. And obviously in the slower classes, there is more opportunity for the monkey mind to begin to air its thoughts that we are being busy to avoid. Question for you. In a world where our devices, the distractions, they're all fighting to control us, they're all fighting for our attention, how can yoga help us find peace?
Well, I think it's a great question, and it's one of the questions of our time. Like I notice now when I'm traveling to classes more and more, and the standard form that you see around you is this. We are all becoming lost in our devices. And there are so many justifications now for us to be looking at our devices. It's the planning, it's the research, it's I need to be in touch. There's just more and more things that are going to get channeled into this space. And of course, we live in a very enticing world that's offering us all of these great things all of the time. And the thing that we have to realize is that when we get lost in those devices, when we get lost in that communication, when we get lost in all of these what we might call material things, we are gravitating away from our center. We are building a relationship with something which can't truly satisfy us. So the example is that you have one ice cream and it might taste great. You have two ice creams, it might even be nice, but by the time you get onto the third, fourth, or fifth, you're edging towards feeling sick. And this is the reality with most things, that at some point they feel great, but then after a while, our relationship starts to shift away from that initial feeling. Except we have the same expectation of that thing and that we get disappointed. What yoga tries to teach us is to explore for ourselves that there is a space within us which is just doing fine, that doesn't need the ice cream, that doesn't need to be on the phone all the time, that doesn't need all of these things that we are conditioned to think that we need in our lives, that we call stability, but that are all subject to change. And it shows us a methodology of connecting to that place within us, experiencing it for ourselves, and as a result of experiencing that peace, it shifts our relationship with everything else. It's called detachment in the yoga context or the yoga language. It doesn't mean that you don't care anymore. It just means that you no longer have so much of a need. And when your desires are slightly reduced and when your needs and your grasping is somewhat diminished, that is the pathway or the portal into clearing the mind and letting our natural essence and presence arise, which if we sit with it for long enough, we will begin to experience that essence is fundamentally peaceful. It's just the mind and its busyness and its distractedness and its constant seeking and searching that gives us the impression that we are not at peace. So any form of yoga practice that is correctly taught and correctly practiced, which means that there is an element of mental focus and concentration into a specific object, trains the mind to learn to be less distracted. And when we're less distracted, our attention is more stable. And when our attention is more stable, our body is more stable. And then gradually that stability leads to a feeling, a visceral experience of a pleasant body. And then we're at home in our home. I said to someone yesterday, imagine if you bought a couch and in the middle of both seats there was like a spike and you have to try and make yourself comfortable on the spike. Most of us are living with these internal spikes. And yoga is a way of just kind of sandpapering or cutting off the sharp spikes and making our bodies inhabitable and homely so that we don't constantly need to be running outside. And yoga offers us that practice, that promise. It doesn't say you must believe, but it says experiment and see for yourself.
In a world where we're raised to believe all of the answers are on the outside, all of the answers are in the things you buy, the places you go to, the activities you do, the friends you have, the followers on the social medias, it's really sounding to me like yoga is helping us to love where we live.
It's helping us to detach from the clutter. It's helping us to detach from the narratives that are thickly laid on culturally and in our family settings and through our social settings, from the moment that we're born, in terms of the things that we should aspire to, the things that are important. And yoga is the radically honest assessment of the way things are. And the way things are is that things change. And everything that you think you're building that appears to be stable will one day change. And this isn't a depressing message. This is not a message that we need to suddenly be up and utter. It's a reality. And imagine if we could just accept that reality. And like in our yoga, we can flow. We can flow with that reality and not resist that reality. That really does bring about a shift in perspective and the way that we feel about our life.
And it doesn't sound like you're saying, or yoga is saying, that the way the world is wrong. It's just saying, how does what you do make you feel?
Yeah, exactly. But not only is yoga not saying that what's going on in the world is wrong, what it's actually saying is that everything that's going on in the world right now is actually there to give you the opportunity to go deeper. Because the suffering in all the great traditions is used as the fuel to make the transformation and to make the transition to this place within that is not subject to all of the ups and downs and all of the difficulties and challenges that apparently arise as a result of our attachment to them in the external world.
As I'm listening to you, I'm now starting to become consciously aware of my breathing. And I'm also aware that at points I do actually hold my breath and then remind myself I need to breathe. I was reading the other day that there is statistics that say that when we're looking at our mobile devices or when we're opening emails, we hold our breath. And you were saying earlier about the importance of breath and how we can hold this tension, which can then lead to neck ache. And there's like a knock-on effect. Just as we wrap up the conversation today, let's talk about breath work, probably a whole nother episode. What are your thoughts on it and how can we get started?
Yeah, I mean, breath work has become a kind of a bit of a hot button topic these days. And it's fair to say that the yogis that were living in the forest and in the mountains thousands of years ago had all of this figured out already thousands of years ago. And that's kind of an amazing thing, really, because they just experientially went inwards. The type of breath work that I teach again comes from this lineage, which is very much about how can we first start to learn how to breathe in a way that is comfortable, in a way that does not create too much effort or strain in the body. And that is the baseline from which you build all of the other, perhaps more complicated techniques that sit on top of that. But it basically says if you're not breathing correctly in the first place, we've got no business doing the more complicated stuff, because all we're doing is bringing those imbalances or those missed patterns, if you like, into something that's more complicated. So the first thing is learning how to breathe in a way that is balanced. And there's a whole thing that we could go into to talk about that. But what I would like to say just very quickly is that my teacher in India always says the effort of breath is your effort of life. That is to say that if you are constantly straining in your breath, you ask someone to breathe in and you can just see everything straining. It's like a gargantuan effort. It's very likely that that kind of effort pattern is playing out in so many different spheres and domains of their life. If you can learn how to breathe, and I have to say that one of the most transformational practices I've done in recent years is the practice that I often share in our studio, to ask yourself the question, how easily can I breathe? And you just keep asking yourself that question and you let the breath respond. And it takes you to an amazing place over time with practice, with guidance. And you realize that you can actually breathe in a way that is much softer. And going back to ahimsa, the non-violence, is not violent towards the body, gives it just what it needs, but also is a reassuring breath. It calms the nervous system, it calms the mind, and it genuinely creates a different felt state within our bodies. So breath is fundamental. In fact, many yogis say that pranayama is hatha yoga. Pranayama is yoga. That is like the main thrust of yoga, is learning how to breathe in a way that calms the mind so that we enter this absorptive state at the higher limbs of the yoga practice. So I would encourage everyone to try to see if they can get in touch with teachers, guides who can help them to learn how to breathe more calmly and gently, because it can bring so many benefits to life.
As I'm listening to your answers, I'm smiling because I'm laughing internally as I observe over the years the different things that I have done to try to get to the place that you are describing. But what I'm hearing you say is it's not about trying, it's about being, it's about doing. You can't get a certificate in how to do it. You have to do it.
You have to do it. And that's the paradox. This is the paradox of all of these traditions, is that there is the effort of non-effort.
Final questions to wrap this episode up. What's something you do with your time now that you think that most people don't?
Without fail, I practice every day. And I have done from the moment I started yoga kind of 9 or 10 years ago. I genuinely haven't missed a day. It doesn't mean I'm doing like long practices every day, but I will do something every day in a formal setting on a mat. And then throughout the day, I'm constantly reminding myself of different things about that practice and bringing myself back into the moment. I can honestly say that that is probably the most fundamental foundation of the journey, is having something that every day you go into the winds and the hurricane of the world, and you have something every day that can not only balance you, but help to cleanse your mind of all of the things that you've accumulated in the last 24 hours. So for me, it may not be that special, and there are certainly lots of other people that do practice every day. But for me, that is the one thing that just feels like an absolute staple, and I hope it remains so for the rest of my days in this body.
What's one thing you would like to add to call this conversation complete?
If you're a hammer, you're always looking for nails. And the reality is that as someone who is, as you can probably tell, very enthusiastic about yoga and the teachings, I would just encourage everyone to connect to a yoga practice, to a breath practice, or to something meditative, something in that space. If you're feeling stressed in your life, if you're feeling overwhelmed, if you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling any kind of way that just doesn't feel pleasant to be in the moment, if you can't sit still for more than 20 seconds, I really, really deeply encourage you to take that first step, to try to connect to a teacher that can help you, whether it be in a studio, whether it be one-to-one, whether it be going on a course. Because as I said earlier, as long as we continue to repeat the same pattern, we will continue to get the same results. So you can use yoga as that small little step outside of the comfort zone of your life at the moment, to just to experiment with whether it can help you shift into a different space, no matter how small. So I really think that for me is the most important thing. And that's the reason why I share this stuff, and it's the reason why I do what I do. It's helped me so much. I've still got a long way to go, like us all, but I can genuinely see the value that it has for me.
Where can they find you online? Obviously, we leave all the links in the show notes. Where can they find you online, and what would you recommend as a first great step based on the work that you have out there for them to try?
So to get a general sense of what I'm up to and the classes I teach and the retreats and all these kind of things, you can go to my website, darynsyogashalla.com. Also, I'm on YouTube at Daryn's Yoga Shala, and there are just lots and lots of videos. There are a few practice videos, but it's generally me talking about yoga philosophy, about how to practice rather than the actuals. But there's also a video or two there about breathing practices, and I'm also on Instagram at Daryn's Yoga Shala. As
we wrap up this conversation, I just want to give an amazing shout out to Daryn and the work that he does. His new YouTube channel is fantastic. Definitely go over there, subscribe, and listen to his videos, because his explanations are as deep and as amazing as they have been on this podcast today. We would love to hear from you, what you've taken away from this, what questions you have, what you would like Daryn to talk about on the podcast when he comes back. And if there is anything that we can ever help you with from the point of view of your time management, your productivity, then please, please, please reach out. And don't forget, if you are loving the podcast, recommend it to a friend and leave a review for us online. Daryn Wober, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure and an honor to have you on the show.
Thanks very much, Abigail. It's been great to chat with you today too.
And until next time, my friends, stay safe, stay well, and remember, it's your time. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode. If you loved what you heard, be sure to let me know by leaving a review so I can keep the good stuff coming. Come and say hi on Instagram at Success by Design Training, or visit my website, successbydesigntraining.com, or connect with me on LinkedIn. Just search Abigail Barnes. Until next time, don't forget, you are amazing and it's your time.